Just a second. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonia Anderson, and I am the National Director for the First 5 Years Fund. The First 5 Years Fund is a nonprofit advocacy organization that's based in Chicago, whose mission is to leverage greater federal investments for high-quality early childhood services and programs. You've heard quite a bit already, I believe, about why these programs are so important. But I did want to just point out 3 things that really characterize and underpin the work that we at the First 5 Years Fund do. Some of which you've already heard mention of. The first is a focus on 0 to 5. This idea that learning truly does begin at birth, and that the longer we wait, the more opportunities we miss for our young children. The second part of this is a focus on at-risk children, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later. But this notion that if you really want to see some of the highest returns on the investments that you make in early childhood programs, you really need to focus on those groups that need it the most. And then the third is this notion of focusing on high quality. There are many in the early childhood community who advocate greater access, so creating more slots, more spaces for young children to participate. And we certainly believe in that and we support that. But our contention is if you don't provide children with the highest quality services, if you don't really give them the skills and tools that they need in order to be successful, then what have you truly accomplished? So those are our 3 tenets. Now, you've actually heard some mention of this statistic several times already from the opening comments, this notion that when we talk about closing the achievement gap, and you probably know, those of you who certainly are familiar with education, you know that this notion of closing the achievement gap is quite important in education circles, and it's a real aim of not only this administration, but of educators throughout the country. But I think oftentimes there's this misperception that the achievement gap starts much later than it actually does. And what you've heard mentioned earlier, and what you'll see here, comes from a 1995 study by a group of researchers called Hart and Risley, who looked at 3 groups of children. The first group of children come from professional parents, college-educated parents. The second group come from working-class parents, and the third group come from families that are on welfare. And what's so striking about this, it really does sum up what you've already heard before. What's so striking is that this notion of the achievement gap actually begins to materialize as early as 18 months. If we think about the number of words that children hear by the time they're 18 months old, you already begin to see some divergence between those children who come from professional families versus those children who come from welfare families. I struggle with the nomenclature a little bit of welfare families, but you get my meaning here. And certainly by the time these children are 36 months old, so 3 years old, we see an ever-widening gap. Hart and Risley found that on average, children who come from professional families hear about 11 million words by the time they're 3 years old. Children who come from welfare families hear about 3 million. So we're talking about stark differences. And it's interesting, as I was preparing for my remarks today, just yesterday I came across an article that I thought was really interesting, and I just wanted to share a little piece of it with you. An organization, a nonprofit called Jumpstart, did an analysis of some data and found the following things. A child who grows up in a middle-class family has been exposed to roughly 1,000 to 1,700 hours of one-on-one picture book reading. The average child growing up in a low-income family has only been exposed to 25 hours of one-on-one picture book reading. 61% of children from low-income families have no age-appropriate books for children in the home. And only half of the children from low-income families entering kindergarten can write their own names, while more than 75% of children from higher income families can do that. So you see, we're talking about very young children, and we're talking about the manifestation already at the very youngest ages of what we later come to term the achievement gap. So part of the imperative, part of the impetus for this work, for this focus on the birth to 5 or birth to 8 continuum, really has to do with closing the window of missed opportunity, and rather than trying to address the achievement gap later on, really trying to head it off at the pass before it has an opportunity to take root. Now, as important as the cognitive piece of childhood development is, things like vocabulary acquisition, we also know that it's not just smarts that get you through school, nor is it just smarts that get you through life. Children obviously need a skill set that's rooted in socio-emotional skills and relational tools that will serve them when they enter school. Because at the end of the day, what we're really focused on is this notion of school readiness. So how do we get kids ready for school? Obviously, we need to focus on the read, write, and arithmetic part. But there's another whole component, and it really has to do with how children come to develop and understand relationships and how they learn how to move through the world. So here are just a couple of characteristics that I think we all know are important in order to be successful in a formal schooling environment. Things like confidence, curiosity, self-control, the capacity to communicate, cooperativeness. We know that these things are important, but we also know that children are not naturally born with these skills and these attributes, right? Children don't know how to self-regulate. They learn this through their relationships with the adults in their lives, be it their parents or be it other caretakers. And yet we know that these things are critically important because when children lack what we call the executive functioning skills, they often encounter challenges when they enter school. I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you in the room that when we look at incidences of referrals to special education, for example, oftentimes those referrals are based as much on behavioral challenges as they are on cognitive challenges. And we know that this is particularly true for boys and even more so for African American boys. So this balance between cognitive development and relational development is very important. Now, as I mentioned earlier, how do kids learn how to self-regulate? They learn this from the adults in their lives, and so it's critically important that parents understand that, and that parents are prepared to equip their children with not only the cognitive and intellectual stimulation that they need, but really prepare them to develop some of those other relational, socio-emotional attributes that I mentioned earlier. There are a number of efforts underway to help parents become better parents. A lot of that work is being done through home visiting models. Perhaps you've heard about Nurse-Family Partnership, Parents as Teachers, Healthy Families America. A number of these models are in operation, and they are really intended to help parents develop better relationships with their children, to help parents excel at the act of parenting, and to help parents be better equipped to give their children the skills and the tools that they need to be successful in school first and then in life after that. In addition to the home visiting models that we know are out there, obviously as children grow up, they will eventually start to function outside of the home, and many children are involved in Head Start or early Head Start programs. A part of the work that the First 5 Years Fund is engaged in, along with other members of the higher education community, is to help parents understand what is it that we mean when we talk about quality early childhood programs. There are a lot of programs out there. Some are good, some perhaps are not so good. But when we talk about the needs of our community, of the African American community, a community that is often challenged by poverty and unemployment and the like, we, the First 5 Years Fund, believes that it's critically important that parents are able to make informed choices about the best opportunities for their children. So one of the things that we really emphasize are things like qualified personnel, when you're looking at these Head Start and early Head Start programs, a language-rich environment, developmentally appropriate curricula, things of that nature, to help parents understand that when we talk about early childhood, we're not talking about babysitting, and that certainly has its place and its role, but we're talking about something that's quite different. We're talking about equipping young children at the very outset with all the intellectual, with all the cognitive, with all the social and emotional skills that they'll need to be successful. And again, as we know, oftentimes in our community, our children have some of the worst options, fewer options, and of lower quality. So really helping parents understand how to advocate and identify high quality models is very important. And the last thing that I want to touch on just quickly is this, give you an example of a concrete model of a high quality early learning setting. At the First 5 Years Fund, we work very closely with a program called EduCare. And EduCare is really a school. It's actually a school for children aged, you can bring your kids there as young as 3 weeks old, and they stay until they're 5 years old. We've recently begun to collect some data around how children who have graduated out of the EduCare at 5 years old, how these children are faring now that they're entering the K-12 sector. And we've been very, very pleased by what we found. So I'm going to just show you two quick sets of data here. The first one is from the PBBT, which is a vocabulary test. And if you look at the graph there, you'll see that on average, the national mean is 100 on this test. Low-income children usually score in the 80 or below range. But for children who have participated in the EduCare model, we see that those kids are scoring at 91.7, close to 92. And more importantly, we also see that for kids who have been in the EduCare system for the entire 5 years, who really started when they were 1 or 2 years old, that the results are quite impressive. These children are scoring at almost 97%, compared to 100, which is the national mean, so that's pretty good. If we look at another test, this is the Bracken test. It's a measure of school readiness, and we find similar results. Again, here we see that the national average is 100. For all children who participate in the EduCare model, they're scoring somewhere around 96.7, so almost 97%. But once again, we find that for children who participated in the EduCare program, anywhere from 3 to 5 years, so those kids who, again, came in right at the beginning and stayed the entire 5 years, those children are really excelling. They're going beyond the national average. Those kids are scoring at almost 110. That's quite impressive if you think about the demographic background that these children represent and the communities that they come from. But the reason why this is so important, we're not just doing this for its own sake. The reason why this is so important is because this fundamentally levels the playing field for these children. These children who have a variety of risk factors, who would ordinarily be in that widening achievement gap, that vocabulary gap that we saw at the beginning, this levels the playing field for these kids and gives them the opportunity to enter the K-12 sector on equal footing with their middle-class colleagues. So last but certainly not least, you've heard the mention of this already from Dr. Jones and from Roberto about what the Obama administration is doing. We in the early childhood community have been thrilled with what we've seen coming out of Washington, D.C. There have been a number of commitments to early childhood that have taken place just since President Obama came to office earlier this year. There's a home visiting bill that's floating around Congress right now to support some of the home visiting programs that I spoke about earlier. In the recovery package, the ARRA, we saw about $2 billion for child care programs and about $2.1 billion combined for Head Start or early Head Start programs. And as you heard mentioned earlier, there is the Early Learning Challenge Fund that the early childhood community is positively ecstatic about. That's recently made its way through the House and it's now working its way through the Senate. So we're very hopeful and optimistic. But I just want to close by saying that if we want to improve our communities, if we want to improve the life trajectories and outcomes for our children, then we have to advocate for early learning opportunities wherever we can find them at the highest quality that we can advocate for, because our children and our communities deserve this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've been joined by two other distinguished members of Congress, member of the Danny Davis from Chicago, who has been a strong advocate for higher education. Danny, do you want to make comments now?
Well, I think I'll pass for the moment.
Okay, and one of our newest members, a gentlelady from Ohio, Marcia Fudge. Let me just recognize another member in the audience. Claude Mayberry is president of the National Council on Educating Black Children. I was there in Indianapolis with his organization just a few weeks ago. Mr. Mayberry. And Gordon McInnes.
That has to be a part and parcel and funded in every single high school. Because that says that all kids can achieve to high levels. Obviously, we also have to do something to make standards clearer, higher, but also fewer. The other thing we have to do is that we have to do things like was suggested in the AT&T study, having an early warning system. But I would go one step further, which is, if I were God, I would have an individual education program for every child who an early warning program detected. Because ultimately, what we then invest in kids at that point, and you know, there's lots of studies about this, the Carnegie study, others show that if at a certain point in 8th grade or 9th grade, a certain number of credits are going to be very highly correlated with kids who are at risk of dropping out. But if we don't, at that point, in either 8th or 9th grade, after an early warning system, really have that kind of individual education program for kids who are at risk of dropout, then what happens is that the costs later on are much, much, much greater, and I think our society's costs that we should, and I think that that is society's issue and problem. So I would put that investment, you know, we had this panel right before us about early childhood. We need to have that kind of investment. But if there was a marginal dollar that I could spend in high schools, it would be on these Scriber programs, AP programs, international baccalaureate programs, as well as this individual education program. And the last two things I'll say very quickly is this. The research we have seen around the country, but the one I am most familiar with is particularly New York, and career and tech ed programs, is that they have actually shown that when you engage kids in a career that they see has a long-standing ability to make them members of the middle class, if not rich, there is higher graduation rate, higher college acceptance rate, and higher college retention rate. And what we've seen in terms of the CTE programs in New York City is a huge change from schools that used to be considered dumping grounds to schools that are now some of the most interesting and competitive for kids to get to. Last thing is this, and the Congress is thinking about this right now. This is something that Arnie Duncan and I both champion. Community schools, which is to find a way, as we're doing all of this, Jeff Canada does it as a neighborhood in Harlem, to co-locate services that children need and their parents need, so that we are actually competing with poverty. Not making poverty an excuse, but competing with poverty. So that we co-locate, like Thurgood Marshall High School does in New York City, a health clinic right in the school. So like we have after-school programs, we have service learning, we have contacts with mentors in the community. Those are the kinds of things I would do. Strivers and AP programs, individual education programs for kids who have been, where we've been warned that they are at risk of dropping out. More robust, good CTE programs and community schooling, as well as community school programs, as well as obviously doing the work we have to do in terms of ensuring that every child has a great teacher. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from our second panelist, Assistant Deputy Secretary for Innovation and Improvement, U.S. Department of Education, James H. Shelton III.
Nobody ever calls me that, so it's always interesting to hear. Thanks for letting me be here today. It's a great honor and privilege to be able to share some thoughts with you and share this panel. I'm really glad that I'm second, because we've already covered a lot of ground, both in terms of statistics and in terms of solutions. So I want to highlight just a few things, because I know that we have a lot of people on this panel who actually have deep expertise around almost everything we're going to talk about. First thing is I want to frame this in the context of the opportunity, really. The unique opportunity that we have here in the face of this crisis is that the President has established the goal that by 2020, people having trouble hearing me?
Yeah.
Is that a little better?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, if you want to use the podium, it might be even better. I don't know. It's up to you. What do you think?
Can you hear me? Okay, now stay here. She just pointed to it.
Great. They really couldn't hear you.
No problem. So, what I was saying is that I want to put this in the context of the opportunity. The opportunity is that we have a president who's established a very firm goal by 2020 to actually put the United States back in a position where we are actually first in the world again on post-secondary completion. The reality is when you back up from that goal, there's only so many ways you can get there. And the very first thing that you look at is the pipeline from high school into college. Which brings me to my very first point that I want to make about the dimension of this problem that we might not talk about. We know that 30% of students nationally don't graduate. We know the statistic that 50% of students who are of color or low income are not likely to graduate. What we don't often talk about enough is that half of those students that do graduate, after doing what everyone asks them to do, showing up every day, graduate not ready to pursue college level work. Think about that. You've done everything that everyone asked you to do. You've taken the classes that you were told you needed to take. You passed them. You got your diploma. You show up to go to college and you find out you're not ready to do college work. That to me is almost, it is as big a tragedy and more of a crime than the students that we allow to walk out the door today. The second part of the crime is this. Bob Balfan, when he talks, should hopefully talk about his research that is actually uncovered the fact that there are roughly 2,000 high schools in this country that account for 50% of the dropouts. He dubbed them the dropout factories. Now here's the part of this that I think is criminal. The ones that I know from DC that are on that list, they were bad when I was in high school. And I pretty much bet that in most of your communities, the high schools that are really, really bad now, the ones where a third of the kids graduate, they would have been bad for a really long time. So the reason I say this is a crime is a shame on us that year after year we would allow students to go to a place where we knew when they walked in the door that 2/3 of them were likely not to walk out at the end of the day. Shame on us to send students to the schools that Randy described, where we know that in fact there is no way that they can take a college preparatory curriculum. The course is just on offer, and we do it every day. We cannot continue to commit these crimes and achieve the president's goal. What should be all of our goal, both morally, economically, for reasons of national security, whichever reason you decide to choose. These are things that we cannot allow to go on. The good news is that there are things very specifically that we know now that we can do about it. What we do know is, and Randy referenced the work in New York, is that there is a way to turn around these low-performing high schools. There is a way to take schools that have had graduation rates in the 30s and turn them into high schools that have graduates in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in the same neighborhoods, with the same parents, with the same community services, by doing things differently, by thinking differently, by providing different services, supports, and creating relationships between the adults and students that weren't there before. By having those high expectations and having them reflected in the content and the curriculum that the students touch every day. By having the work be engaging so that they actually can see the connection between what they're learning in class and the real world. So that the question that when it gets asked about what am I ever going to do with this actually gets answered. And when the phone that the student picks up to call and ask for help in the after hours also gets answered by an adult who knows how to help. These are things that we already know how to do. We also know that these early indicator systems that Randy talked about, they work. See, it's interesting, if you had a graphic up here that credit accumulation during the freshman year, it literally looks like a stair step. If you get 6 credits or more during your freshman year, your odds are better than 75% that you're going to graduate. Below 6, the next point down at 5, it's already dropped 20 points. And it keeps going down until you're about 17% likely if you don't accumulate 2 or 3 credits. So we know in 9th grade at a minimum, but actually prior to that, who's likely to graduate. That's the third part of the crime. How can we know that we can look at the data in 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, identify the students need particular supports, be they social, emotional, or academic. Know that if we give those students those supports, they have a much higher likelihood of success. And one, not track that data, and 2, not doing anything about it when we got it. So you're going to see a lot of emphasis from us in the department, focusing on getting these data systems in place, asking the districts to actually track this information, and then to use it. You're going to see us asking districts and states to, when they see these schools that are persistently failing year after year after year, not to mess around the edges, but to take the kind of radical intervention that it requires to actually transform the school environment. You're going to see us talking about the right that students have to have access to college-ready curriculum. You're going to see us talking about the kind of dropout recovery programs that we know, because even in the best circumstances, we know we lose them, and students have to have the opportunity to get back on track. You're going to have us asking questions like, why does a student have to sit in class in order to get their credit if they can demonstrate proficiency and mastery? How can a student catch back up if in fact they always have to sit for that class? And in fact, it's not offered in the second semester if you failed during the first semester. What are the barriers that we put in the way of students being able to accomplish their goals and pursue their dreams? And over again, you're going to hear the president and the secretary and everyone from the department talking about having our students graduate college and career ready. See, the reality is that study after study has shown that in fact, when people used to talk about college and career, it used to be an escape valve on the level of the standards, thinking that, oh, the career readiness stuff, that's a lower standard. Well, the studies say now, it's very clear, career ready standards are actually higher. That in fact, in reading, writing, and mathematics, the basic skill set that you need to be successful in most jobs, talk to somebody who's taking the electrician's apprentice exam, is the same as what you need to be successful as a freshman in college. But on top of that, the critical thinking, the teamwork, the communication skills, written and oral, that's what's expected at work. We need to deliver on all of those things. Those are the things you're going to hear us talk about. We can build those into the systems that we create. We can deliver them in the policies and promises that we make to our students. And if we do it well, we'll do it much more efficiently. And I'm talking about the time. Because students deserve to have the kinds of learning opportunities that allow them to connect the real world to their school. Students should not have to do homework. And if you ask students about their high school experience, in most cases, that's the adjective you get back first. So I'm sorry I haven't been super cheerful today. I think that the real hope for me is that we know what needs to happen. It's just a matter of if we have the will. We know that these schools need to be turned around. The question is, will we stand up when it's time for the tough decisions? We know we need better teachers in our classrooms. The question is, will we ask them to make way for them? We know we need to have students who can step up. And the question is, will we support them? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I agree with you. We need to use our research in a more positive way. You may know that over the past decade or so, the number of prison cells that are going to be projected for 20 years out usually is determined by the statistics in the 4th grade. They were already prepared for that, so they're using statistics for things of that nature. We need to use those same statistics with those failing schools because we know where they are to improve them. The next presenter will be Dr. Robert Valfens. He's an Associate Research Scientist, the Center for Social Organizations of Schools.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Well, Jim stole my fire, so I have to give the details now. But I want to say one thing that's really making me very excited here is that I think there's 3 drivers that's going to help solve this crisis and make it possible for every student to graduate high school ready for college and career and actually get some post-secondary training and education, which is essential for everybody. And those key partners are going to be the nation's teachers, the federal government, and the community. What I want to do is help arm the community to do their part to keep everybody on their toes. So I just want to fill you in with a few key facts to keep in mind, just so you can do your part as the third leg of this force, which is what we need to end the crime that Jim so eloquently described. So the first thing, as you've heard, that talk. There are 2,000 high schools which produce half the nation's dropouts, but 2/3 of its minority dropouts. These are high schools where graduation is not the norm and has not been the norm for a long time. And we know something about where these schools are located. Half are our nation's cities, the other half are throughout the South and Southwest, often in rural, low-wealth communities. We also know that a quarter of these schools, believe it or not, are the only high school in town. Think what that says for equal opportunity in America. You having been born in a town where the only high school is one in which graduation is not the norm, in an era when the only way to participate in society is to graduate from high school, prepare for college and career. The other thing to keep in mind about these schools is that we know quite a bit about inside of them, what their dynamics are. And in the main, if you go into one of these schools and you go into the 9th grade and you say, who's in the 9th grade? You're going to find that only 1 out of 5 of those students are the students high schools are typically designed to educate. That is students who are in the 9th grade for the first time, are on age, attended school, middle school, and have at least 7th grade or above math and reading skills. Not even grade level, but close to grade level. That's only 1 out of 5 of the kids. 4 out of 5 kids are either overage, repeating 9th grade, became disengaged from schooling in middle school, and were missing a month or more of schooling by 8th grade, or so this is an example. This is Philadelphia's high schools a few years back. Each one of those lines is a high school. The first line is 20%. And we can see almost all the neighborhood non-selective high schools, less than 20% of the kids were on age, first-time freshmen, who came to middle school and had within 2 years of grade level skills. So that means that 4/5 of the kids need extra help. They need more than just a good lesson every day. They need ways to overcome their skill gaps, to get them remotivated to school, to get them back on age with their peers. They need a good everyday experience plus something more. Now think about that. These schools often have 300, 400, 500 kids in the 9th grade. So now we have hundreds of kids needing extra help in the 9th grade. And you can see how the schools rapidly get overwhelmed. Because do we put the educational equivalent of the Army Rangers in those schools? The most skilled, the most dedicated, the most creative folks? No. We often put the least experienced, the most transient, the most, polished people there, because that's the least desirable assignment. So we're having our greatest need, and we're massing some of our weakest resources. And that's how these schools perpetuate year after year after year. The final thing to keep in mind is that we know, starting in 6th grade, that at least half the kids that are going to drop out are waving their hands. They're starting to stop coming to school, they're starting to get in trouble, they're failing math and English. We want to believe that that's adolescence. Everyone hated the junior high, we all had people that were crazy then and grew out of it. But we find again and again, especially in high poverty environments, kids don't grow out of it, it gets worse. The kid in 6th grade who's not coming to school a lot, but is behaving and is getting by 9th grade is not coming, getting in trouble and failing everything. So we really have to think about integrated middle and high school solutions. And really a 6 through 14 continuum. That's the pathway. You have to have effective early education, great primary schools, everyone reading by 3rd grade. But even if we do that, a student's interaction with their peers, their neighborhood, and themselves changes in early adolescence. That's when you make an independent decision to be engaged in school. You're going not because your parents tell you, not because your teachers tell you. You're deciding, am I engaged in this enterprise called schooling? So even if you had some early inputs that were good, you can still fall off track. So that's why we really have to have a 6 through 14 continuum. How do we get there? What will it look like inside? Well, I'm just going to get this one first. From a community perspective, if someone's telling you, hey, I'm going to transform this school, we're going to make it better, what should be on your check marks to see if they're doing the right thing? Well, the first thing you want to say is down at the bottom. Is the whole school organized to meet the educational challenge it faces? If half of its kids are coming in below grade level, does it have a strategy for that? And a capacity to actually reach all those kids? If 30% of the kids are coming in with poor prior chronic absenteeism, do they have a plan up front to deal with that instead of reacting to it after it happens? If they know they have lots of kids with social emotional issues, do they have enough mentors and enough folks to actually deal with every kid so they're not doing triage? Do they have high student engagement so students will want to attend, behave, and try? Do the teachers actually have collective efficacy? Are they organized as such, and is their job and structured as such so that can be created? Because again, think of it, we ask an individual teacher, here, you teach 25, 30 kids per class, you teach 5 classes, that's 150 kids, you share them with almost nobody, good luck, solve all their problems. That's overwhelming. Maybe if 10 kids need help, you could do it, but remember, maybe it's 75 or 80 kids need help. And if we put it on one lone teacher by themselves, that's beyond even capacity, right? So we have to find ways to organize teachers into teams, give them time to do this work, because getting kids engaged is as equally as important as teaching them a good lesson. Because they're not there, they're not attending, it doesn't matter how creative your lesson is. We have to have extra support so we're not doing triage. If we're honest, in most of our high-needs schools, we do triage. We have a counselor, we have a social worker. A social worker with a caseload of 100 kids is not a social worker, okay? So we have to make sure the number of adults that can help the kids equals the number of kids in need. It's a great place to start thinking about national service and your peers. There's many eager young youth who will give the year. They are from the neighborhoods or not, but they relate to the kids in a different way. They can do the daily nagging and nurturing. Are you in school? Did you get your homework done? I saw you giving Mr. Jones a hard time. I know he's a tough customer, but it's not the way to act. Let's meet at lunch to get your homework done. That's the kind of support we need, not a mentoring program for 10 kids when 100 kids need it. And finally, we need case-managed supports for the kids that need it most. Professional support to the kids. If a kid is staying home and getting his grandma a diabetes shot because he trusts no one else to do it, until we solve that, the kid's not going to be in school. Last thing, policy. 3 things to keep in mind. The solution is a federal, state, local, and community partnership. Communities bear the cost of dropouts. Schools don't bear that cost. There's another group of customers the next year. The community bears the cost, so the community has got to be the driving force to keep them focused on the problem. Next issue, stimulus money. Fantastic opportunity. There's $3 to $4 billion, depending on your count, in school improvement money. Unprecedented. They're going to be up to $1 million for a school for 3 years in a row for big change. You've got to keep them honest. The easiest way to deal with this is to rearrange the deck chairs. Well, the principal's been there for a while, let's fire him. That's our reform. We got a new principal, so it must be the teachers. Let's get rid of a few of that. Now, it's a district that's all bad. Let's just cut the school off from the district. Now, any and all of those may be needed in some circumstances, and they may absolutely be fundamental, but that alone is not enough. The school doesn't have an educational design to meet its challenge. If it doesn't have resources against the size of the problem, rearranging the deck chairs is not going to change anything. And so we have to make sure that for big dollars, there really is big dramatic change. And it's both creating the will and the capacity to solve the problem. Finally, federal policy. Congressman Scott's Every Student Counts bill is fundamental. That's telling us that we measure everyone accurately and we give states ambitious goals to raise graduation rates, not 1 point per year, so in 50 years you're up to 90%. And also, the stimulus is fantastic, but it's still a 3-year thing. We need to have things like the Graduation Promise Act and success in the middle, so we have a continuous way to match the resources to solve the problems, and then we can hold people's feet to the fire to say, are you in the right schools? Do you have a 6 to 14 solution? And does your design and capacity match the actual size of the problem? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've been joined by another one of our members of Congress, Congresswoman Diane Watson from Los Angeles, California, will come to give you brief greetings, and then she will then be immediately followed by Dr. Sheila Simmons from the Director of the Department of Simmons, right, Director of Human and Civil Rights National Education Association, Dr. Simmons, after we hear from Ambassador Watson.
I want to thank my distinguished colleague, Donald Payne, for always keeping his commitment to youth and education. Let's give him a hand. He is someone who acts on his beliefs and moves out in a hurry. If we miss him on a Monday, he's in Africa. Any place I go, I look up and there is Don Payne, letting no grass grow under his feet, because he believes in the world diaspora for all of our youth, and particularly black youth. And very briefly, I want to thank all of you for having the interest in this workshop. I had one earlier, but it was about entertainment. It was packed. But you see, when you talk about education, you still have some vacant chairs, because we lost that commitment. And I want to speak as a representative of a group that understood what education could do. You know, when we moved from the plantation and were emancipated, and you went to your segregated schools, your teacher told you the way out was education. So we just understood it. I'm not too far removed from emancipation, a few generations down the line. But we never had to sit at the dinner table and be convinced that we needed to go on after graduation. And graduation was understood. You didn't drop out of school. In spite of the fact that my father was a police officer, my mother liked hot cereal, my sister and I hated it, and he'd sit across the table with his hips, with his guns on his hips, his hat, his full uniform, and just look at us. He was 6'5". He didn't have to say a word. We ate all that lumpy, hot cereal. And I remember at that time I said, I'll never eat cooked cereal when I get to the age of consent. But you see, we understood and obeyed. His mother was in a convent for 13 years. They were Roman Catholics. So, you know, you just understood what you had to do. And that's what we have to do with our youth today. They have to understand that the only thing that cannot be taken away from you is your education. That's right. And you can buy a big car from the money you earned illegally, and you can buy the blink blinks and, you know, the chains and so on. Those can be taken from you and will be, but they can never take your education. And I don't know if we lost something when we started to integrate. But I tell you, one thing we did lose was the constant reminder how important education was. We cannot allow our children to drop out. Because you see, we live in a global society today. And you know, in California, which is the largest state in the union and the first state to be a majority of minorities. And guess what? Most of ours come across the Pacific, not over the southern border like most people think. And so we need to know how they think and their languages. So in California, we said to get your degree, you're going to have to take 2 foreign languages. Of course, you're going to take Spanish, because Spanish is spoken in Southern California. But you need to, and I told my niece before she passed away at age 22, I said, take Chinese. Later on, you'll understand why. And of course, she didn't make it to that point. But she started to take Chinese. And I would say to all of you that are connected to youth, they need to learn the languages of the people they're going to be associating with in a decade or two. Because business is done universally around the globe. You cannot be competitive unless you can read, you can write, you can compute, and you can understand how other people think. And you find that out when you start to study their languages. So I want to back up my dear colleague and say, education is the most important issue and then health comes next. But we won't even get into that. But the most important issue we can devote this conference to. So thank you so very much, and thank you for your continuous commitment.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You can do better than that. There are too many people in here. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Great, great. First thing I want to say, I am so impressed to see these young people in the room today. This is about you. This is about what we as adults are committing ourselves to do for all of you, and particularly the young man here. The second thing I'd like to do is give honor to one of our elders that's in the room today that has been a champion and a steward for public education, and that is Adeline Sanford, who's in the room. So I definitely want to give honor to her. Thank you.
From New York City, we brought 90 young people from 7 high schools.
Now you see why I said we have to give honor to our elder. She is the person that has always done it and is still doing it. And to be honest, I could almost sit down right now because here's our future right here. She's done a great job. Let me say this and see if you know who said this. If you can control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his action. He will go without being told, and if there's no back door, his very nature will demand one. Does anyone know who said that? Oh, Carter G. Woodson. Yes, that is what Carter G. Woodson said. And here is what I want to give some points on today. And that is the important success of African American students, but in particular, the success of African American young boys. A couple of facts. In 2006, more than 1/2 of black male students did not graduate on time. And in 10 states, Georgia, Florida, Illinois, Louisiana, Nevada, to name a few, they had the lowest graduation rate of African American males in the country. Also, in addition, we have more African American boys being disproportionately underrepresented and gifted and talented and overrepresented in special education. And they are more likely to be retained in grades, more likely to be identified for those special ed services, and more likely to be suspended or expelled from school. The bottom line is that we want teachers, education support professionals, school district administrators, those who do the work to implement effective strategies and programs in order to support our students. I think it's very important for us to talk about this issue of leadership in the school, and the leadership is not just the principal alone. The leadership includes the teachers. The leadership also includes the cafeteria worker, the people in the office, the custodians, because we all come together in public education to begin to look at this issue of effectiveness. Now, when we talk about systemic interventions, that becomes a part of the systemic interventions. And I want to connect this to what we heard at the first session, and that is this whole issue of advocating for early childhood. See, we can't start talking about increasing the graduation rate once they get to high school. We have to start talking about increasing graduation rate when they are in, well, actually pre-K and before they come. And as Congressman Watson just said, I too, my parents, it was like, there was no issue whether or not I was going to go to college, it was where. But I think that we also have to understand that we need to have students that are career ready, because everyone, number one, cannot afford it, unfortunately. But also there are other areas where many of our students are very, very excellent in, and they too can become successful. Now, Bob, you didn't talk about this, but one of the things that we do at the National Education Association in working with our members around effectiveness is making sure that they understand their role in the main transition points for students as they go through school. And the first one, we talked about this a little earlier, and that was the whole issue of kindergarten with the oral language, pre-reading, and social skills. Now, you're going to hear me say social skills all the way through, because remember what the last person said, is that if in fact you don't know how to act, regardless of what happens, young people, you might not get a chance to act. The second is that the second transition is leaving the second grade. We have to make sure, and we're committed to working with students to making sure that they are on grade level reading and math when they leave the second grade, okay? Because if we wait till the third, we know what the third grade said, so why wait until then? Then entering middle school. Clearly, there is a main transition there, because students need to have those academic and social skills to be successful. When you're entering middle school, you're coming out of self-containment, and you're going into a whole new world, and what will happen to those students? And then, how do we track to make sure students stay on track for graduation? Providing that extra support, particularly for those struggling young students. And again, all of our work we have been doing has really been based on Bob's work, and one of the things that came across very clear is that if we don't have those early warning signs, and it's not just having the signs, but what do we do once we have identified and been told about those signs? And here is where the effectiveness and the teaching and the responsibility of classroom teachers come into play. And one thing that's very important, when we talk about the effectiveness and a part of this systemic intervention, professional development is at the center of all of these interventions. Study after study has said, we have actually seen the statistics, that the teacher is at the center. If we do not provide the type of professional development, and I mean job-embedded professional development, not drive-by professional development. Professional development that looks at literacy, looks at math, looks at coaching, looks at mentoring. But let me add one last thing. It also looks at our students. How do we begin to have professional development that gets to the issue of our students come with assets? Yes. They do not come with deficits. They come with them sometimes, but you know what? If we begin to use the asset model, and very quickly let me say what I mean by asset models. We have to understand that culture plays a major role in education. And when I say culture, I'm not just talking about the small c in terms of race and ethnicity. Culture in terms of values, in terms of system, in terms of what's important in the home. Culture with the big C. Then we have to think about abilities. Every child comes with abilities. Every child. They might be underdeveloped, they might be not reaching the potential, but we have to acknowledge that they come with abilities. Then the R is resilience. My grandmother used to call it stickability. How do we transfer those skills that students come with? And guess what? Many of them do things that those of us in this room as adults could not do and maneuver from the time they leave our classroom to the time they come back the next day. But the issue is, how do we build on those skills that they then become leaders, they become academic leaders, they become leaders in their school and go on to be leaders in our community? And then the E is effort. How then do we make sure that they are putting forth their best effort? And you know how? It's our responsibilities as adults to motivate them, to make sure that they are doing those things. And lastly, I want to challenge each and every one of you that are an adult in this room. we, the adults, have the responsibility to making sure that our students have that adult contact. One of our oldest and most revered educators said that if children don't have that adult contact in the home, it's our responsibility as community members. It's our responsibility as children that we, even if they are not our children, they're someone else's child. And what are we going to do to make sure that that is being taken care of? And the last thing that I want to say is that there's a program in New York, in Syracuse, New York, Say Yes. And I want to leave this as an example and as a solution. Say Yes in New York is a combination of the city of Syracuse, Syracuse University, and the local teachers union, where they have said yes to the fact that every last student, 26,000 students in that district, will be prepared to go on to college. They have a commitment that every child will get a scholarship at any state and 25 private universities in the state of New York. And how did they do that? They began to address what they call the pre-K support program to erase those barriers and those obstacles. The first barrier had to do with health. They make sure that every student in that school district has the proper health care and health needs. The second thing they do, they look at the emotional and social needs of that student. Every school then has a social worker that's working there. The third part has to do with the financial obstacles. Then they work with the parents to make sure that if there are needs, financial needs for those children, someone within that city, someone within that district will see to it that those needs are met. And then of course the last thing is the academic obstacles that they face. Here is where we see an entire community coming together to say yes. Saying yes to graduation, saying yes, our students will be successful, but above all, teachers, educators, and other members of the education community are saying yes, we are committed to making a difference. Before I leave, I just want to say all of you have their packets. NEA has produced 2 reports about the Black status of students in education, and you also have in your packet, there is a pocket guide on preventing students from dropping out of school. Very, very simple, but very complex kinds of issues that can be handled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. Next speaker will be Dr. Anita Bailey-Perry, but before she speaks, I want to introduce another one of our colleagues who is a member of the Judiciary Committee and one of the co-sponsors of this workshop as a member of the CBC Education Subcommittee, the gentle lady from Texas, Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. We appreciate Congressman Scott's commitment to education, and we tend to be affectionate in our main calling, and so he has elevated himself. Dr. Simmons, I thank you, and all of the panelists have been just a delight. I would say in this room, as I look at you, if you want to shake your arms, you can do that before I talk. Why don't everybody shake their arms to lose circulation? There we go. There we go. I knew somebody needed to do that, shake their head. This has to be the most important site in this whole convention. And those of you who are cited here, I am humbled and honored by your presence in this room. I know there are students, teachers, advocates, theorists, if you will, and members of Congress who are busily trying to learn from you. But let me offer a confession and a plea for help because we are living, as you know, in challenging times. We could have had this session when none of us would have been born some 40 years ago, talking about education, and all we would have to say for those people of color and minorities, women, get yourself an education. That is your pathway to success. And there will be an audience of young people, and that's 40 years ago, I'm trying to see what the attire would be, bushes and other types of styles, dashikis and others, or maybe they'd be hula hooping, I'm trying to think of that, 1960s. And most people would, short of acting like West Side Story, be saying, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a stop off and be a little rebel, but I'm going on to college, or I am going to get an education, or I'm going to get the skills of a tradesman, and I'm going to work. My friends, we do not have that kind of easy pathway anymore. And the reason why I stand here with a plea for a very brief moment and an extension of collaboration and an appreciation is I come from the state where we have over a 50% rate of dropout. But it is indicative of the nation. And so our headline for this particular session is early childhood education and the laying of the groundwork, but also recognizing that we are at a point where we're needing a call to action. So I have just one or two points, and I want to be able to acknowledge Dr. Berry. I'm so delighted that she has come and accepted my invitation, accepted the invitation to be here with us today, because she's a very special person in a very special institution that we have a great love and affection for. But what I am looking for most is, as we work with our national organization, whether it's the NEA and a number of others who are advocates for education, whether or not we're working with the Department of Education. Dr. Duncan is a new and fabulous voice for education. He's a superintendent. He comes out of a big city school district. How are we spending the money? Are we spending our dollars effectively? There is no doubt that I cry every day for Leave No Child Behind. Very good intentions. But as we members of Congress who have said, who were wearing the hat of the other party for 8 years, you can't instruct and give direction to schools and teachers and give them no resources. You cannot label classes and label people as non-performing, and you've given them no tools to work with. I don't know about the Egyptians when they were building the pyramids, but I assume they didn't stand back and say, I want a pyramid. Whatever their tools were, they had to get blocks and they had to move in an orderly fashion. And so our pain is that, yes, we had a scheme, a structure, but what did we do about the resources? So here we are, holding the bag. But we have stimulus dollars. And I'm sure that I missed educators who said the DOE has the largest pocket of stimulus dollars probably of any agency to be spent by 2010. So would you do me a favor and make yourselves a committee of one? We can all be reached. You see our names. We're going to have to be engaging with Arnie Duncan on how these resources are going to be used. The reason why I have such pain, because I realize that the formula that had to be used, and Dr. Bailey Perry realizes, some of these were formula dollars that went to our school districts. That's okay, but others went to our state agencies, and we're still working and waiting for dollars to get down to those of you in the grassroots. I know I come from a state where I'm frighteningly waiting for dollars. Monies that were going to be used in school districts, because it did not come formula. $3 billion in the state of Texas was used for the rainy day fund. It's still sitting there. Somebody in my community could use those dollars. And this is not states and legislators' fault. This is, we have a CEO that can, by the name of governor, that can use those dollars. So some of you are in a friendly atmosphere. But we shouldn't wait on whether or not we're in a friendly state or a non-friendly state when the President of the United States, with his First Lady, has made a commitment to education where he's made the stimulus dollars lodge in the Department of Education. So we need you to be critics in a constructive way to say, you know what, where are the monies? Right. Get to the school districts. Ask them why they're not using Dr. Simmons or others in constructing how those dollars on the ground should be used. Because unless you live in, parts of Beverly Hills or in Houston, parts of River Oaks, you've got some numbers that are very poor on dropout rate because it is a national issue. Go back and say, do you have a call to action on targeting this whole question of dropout. I don't want to leave those who are in the school out of the picture. They need to be included, and I know that others have spoken about teacher instruction and those collaborations, professional development, this whole issue of critiquing school, this whole over-testing that we do. But I want to know how the money that are being sent, that we don't look back 5 years from now and say, did we spend 20 billion, 30 billion, 10 billion, and did not put a dent in the dropout rate? Did not have a call to action to work with faith organizations who are unbiased and free and taking children from all walks of life? Those that are coordinate with our public housing, they can do work on site, catching kids as they linger in these places when they should be in school, or doing an on-site school. We had an on-site school in our public housing. It got crushed by lack of funding. So the kids went out of their apartments in public housing into a school. Isn't that exciting? Right on the ground. So nobody could detour off. We've got to have this kind of creative thinking. So as a member of the Judiciary Committee, I see a correlation in education. Because I know that Congressman Scott spoke about the Promise Act, of which I'm an enthusiastic supporter of, which is a detour from the juvenile justice system. But we cannot detour and use those kinds of sympathetic and creative thinking for juveniles who have gotten in or maybe in the criminal justice system if we don't put a stopgap and get in front of, John Lewis always says, his quote, get in the way of this surging dropout rate and a crisis that is going to have us overtaken by the likes of China, maybe Iran, maybe North and South Korea, maybe places in South America, and we are really part of the world population. We don't mind being friends, but being overtaken, which says that we're not doing the best for our children. So I hope that you will join us as we make our way through this issue. It may not be the question of illiteracy, which maybe might get you more excited that we had a 60% illiterate rate in the United States, but it might be just the same. Because if you drop out, you are not at the cutting edge of technology and what's happening in the world. You're not reading and understanding whether or not we're at peace or war. You don't know whether there's a green economy or no economy. You don't know what choices to make in buying a house or providing for your family. So education is crucial. And I believe it is important to do so. I conclude, as I just make note of Dr. Bailey Perry, is to say this. I chair the Congressional Children's Caucus, and we look forward to taking on this issue ongoing. But one of the issues that I think is important, and one of my colleagues had this as a proposition, that's why I mixed Judiciary and Education Committee that I'm not on, is what about this, and I think my colleague, Congressman Jackson, has been raising this issue, and that is education as a constitutional right. That sounds like we're stretching, but two issues that were left out, unless you pursue pursuit of happiness, you might include in that, is healthcare and education. And we are sunk without both of them. So I hope you're supporting a good public option, but these are creative thinking that we want to do. But I hope that what we will conclude is if we can do anything, we can write legislation, but we need to find out, is the money getting to you? Are we breaking the cycle? And if we're doing so, then we've made a difference in the lives of our children. I'm delighted that Dr. Danita Bailey Perry from Texas Southern University in the 18th Congressional District, the school of Barbara Jordan and Mickey Leland, if you've heard those names, has come, as they say, this far to be with you today. She is an expert on quality education for African American children and all children. And I view her credentials as superb. Dr. Bailey Perry is a 2009 recipient of the Texas Alliance of Black School Educators Empowerment of Learners of African American Descent Research Award. She won the award for her peer-reviewed research paper titled Minority Women and the Glass Ceiling. Dr. Bailey Perry is a tenured professor at the School of Education at Texas Southern University, which has been noted as producing the most number of students, of teachers for the state of Texas. It has a great school of education, and we are very, very glad to have this jewel in our midst, a state institution that is predominantly African American. Our colleague is here, the Dean of the School of Communication, who understands that our children need to be able to communicate, and they can't do that if they drop out. Dr. Ward, would you please stand? We're very glad to have you here with us. So Congressman Scott has been very kind with his gavel, but I hope each place I've gone, I've said, join with us. You can find us easily. If nothing else, give us reports back on the stimulus dollars, whether you're in our districts or not. Maybe you are aware there are not Congressional Black Caucus members. I wish that you would, because it is so very important. I end on this note. One of the areas that I work on is mental health, and combined with the dropout rate is the poor amount of mental health resources that we have for our children in primary and secondary schooling. School nurse is somewhat extinct. They could at least assess why someone is acting up. And so when you look at the criminal justice system, you can be assured there may be a population that really needed some mental health services. That is an advocacy that we need to increase. And legislative initiatives are part of it, but funding is another part. So when you finally conclude ensuring the academic success of African American youth and addressing the question that Dr. Anita Bailey Perry is going to address, keep in mind that you also have to have the tools. So Dr. Bailey Perry, I know that you're going to, since you know how to certify schools and give us the rules, please come forward. Thank you very much.
Let me just say, there's a high degree of agreement on this panel that high quality preschool opportunities really count for poor kids. And I think that I would go further and say this, that you would be better off if I had been successful in convincing Jacqueline Jones to take my 10 minutes, because she has actually had the experience of working with 31 districts in New Jersey to improve the quality of preschool education. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about what that experience is in New Jersey and why it is important for the national discussion on preschool, because I think we have a head start in the level of support for preschool, in the requirements and standards and expectations that have been set, and what happens when you do try and improve the quality. But let me say, you'll probably at the end of this say, why did they invite him to speak? After all he did was really share things we already know, that we agree on, that it's sort of plain, simple stuff. And it's the plain, simple stuff that has been well known and widely ignored when we come to make policy, when we come to adopt budgets, when we set priorities. Because we have talked for many, many years about the importance of a high-quality early start. And we know that from the evidence that is growing, that we're accumulating, that this is a critical investment. And yet when we go to adopt local, national, state budgets, we ignore the implications of this evidence that has been collected. And it is overwhelming evidence. There's an argument about the payoff from investing in high-quality preschool. And the argument is whether we're getting 4 times the return on our dollar or 11 times the return. That's the gap of disagreement. But nobody says that it's an even up deal. Everybody agrees that this is a payoff that you cannot get from just about any other public investment. And that's not just true in the United States, it's true across the world. So the important point is that this is something that we all share right now. The problem is that when Congress goes to vote, or when our state legislature goes to vote, or when the governor goes to set the budget, these well-accepted, well-known principles are not reflected in the decisions that are made. And that's unfortunate, and has been true for many, many years. Dr. Anderson did a great job of quantifying this gap that exists for poor children. I stated it a little different way, which is we know this. And this is not based on a sample study where 15 kids in El Paso were compared with 15 kids that didn't go to preschool. And it's not based, this is based on millions of tests that have been administered over many years, not just in third grade or fourth grade, but in terms of kindergarten readiness, in terms of Peabody vocabulary tests, in terms of all sorts of things. We know this code, and that is that the gap that exists for a 60-month-old, 5-year-old kindergarten student coming from a poor family is likely to be in the range of 9 to 18 months. You're 60 months old, the gap is already 18 months. You're a year and a half behind. Now, kids from poor neighborhoods make 9 months of progress on average in kindergarten. But so do the middle-class kids. And during the summer, middle-class kids keep making progress. Poor kids fall behind a month or so. By the time we're in fourth grade, poor kids are 2 years behind on average. And for the 50% who manage to get a diploma, not necessarily something that certifies they're ready for a 4-year university degree, but get a diploma, they are 4 years behind their middle-class peers. 4 years. So trying to stop this problem by addressing the needs of 6th graders who are reading at the 4th grade, it's too late. Because here's something else that we know. Starting kindergarten with 18 months behind, if you get to 4th grade and you're reading below grade level, you have less than a 1 in 10 chance, 1 in 10, of ever reading at grade level. 1 in 10. You are 10 years old. This is not just an investment question. This is not just a pedagogical puzzle that we've got to solve. This is a moral issue about the urgency with which our public schools address the kindergarten gap that they're expected to deal with. Public schools, by and large, do not give that gap the urgency that is required. State governments do not give that gap the urgency that is required because we know two things. We know what the origin of the gap is, and Dr. Anderson laid that out clearly. Kids who come to kindergarten with inadequate vocabulary, general knowledge, ideas, stories, familiarity with print. That's the problem. We also know how to narrow that gap through high-quality preschool. And we have evidence that that gap can be narrowed. There are studies, longitudinal studies that have gone on for 25 years, Perry Preschool, Ebersudarian, is that how you say that? Chicago preschool study indicate that kids who attend preschool, high-quality preschools do so much better than their neighborhood friends who did not attend preschool in terms of finishing high school, getting jobs, staying out of jail. Again, huge payoff. So what we have is this opportunity. I need to move quickly to explain a little bit about New Jersey's experience with this. For 5.5 years, I was responsible for the Supreme Court ordered program, which insisted that each of the 31 poorest districts in New Jersey provide a high-quality preschool. And there was a disagreement about what that meant. And the court came back after a second case and said, here's what we mean, 15-to-1 ratio, no more than 15 kids in a classroom. All teachers must have a BA degree. They must be certified with a pre-kindergarten, third grade degree certificate. They must be assisted with a teacher's aide. There's got to be at least 950 square feet. I mean, our Supreme Court can be very specific at times. And it must meet very high standards and expectations that have been delineated by the Department of Education. Well, that sounds terrific. And we spend more money on educating 3- and 4-year-old kids than any state in the country by a lot. In fact, we only have about 2% of the kids in the country, but we spend about 11 or 12% of all the money that's spent on preschool in the country. We spend about $500 million a year. And by itself, having the money in the 15-to-1 ratio will not do it. this leads to the point about the experience of trying to improve quality, and it begins with the very things that have been mentioned, having clear, concrete expectations that are spelled out so everybody can see it, having a curriculum that is high quality, that forces teachers to find those moments that are not easy to find, and where they need a lot of help to know what to do when it arises, so that the children's play turns into children's learning. We think that's pretty simple. It's not. And legislators who see that this is taking $12,500 a year for educating 3-year-olds can't imagine how that could be. They think, okay, $12,500 a year for advanced placement physics, but not for 3-year-olds. In fact, it is complicated. It is part art, part science, part math. And learning that is very difficult. Most school districts have no experience with it. It's essential that departments of education develop the cadre of people with this experience and expertise, and they're in scarce supply, and organize it so they relentlessly work with the school districts that are providing preschool, either directly or through community providers. And that experience in New Jersey resulted in a dramatic improvement in quality, as it's typically measured by the internationally accepted Eckert standard. My second point, and I now have no time to give it, because I like to yak, is, and I'll just do it in the 31 seconds remaining. The second point is, high quality preschool is the first step. The payoff comes when it's connected organically to what happens to kids in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade. Do that, and follow that with a rich curriculum which is designed to engage teachers and students, and you will find that this gap can not only be narrowed, it can be closed. And we now have evidence from Montgomery County, Maryland, from Union City, New Jersey, West New York, Elizabeth, Perth Amboy, Vineland, New Jersey, that this can close the gap so that kids who have benefited from preschool and are in schools that have high-quality K through 3 intensive literacy programs can perform at the state average in New Jersey, which is the second highest average in the country. Now, that's not good enough, but it's not a bad start. Thank you very much.